All right, so we're moving into Lightburn here, and I'm really going to touch on, again, we're not really getting into designing in Lightburn, but we're talking about what happens after you've got your design. This is actually a design I worked on for a customer. That took me quite a bit of time. He wanted to engrave these color guard rifles. So this is the butt end of a rifle. And basically the layers are just a way to incorporate a variety of settings into a single job. So you can set all your parameters per color. In this case, we're going to try to do these different parts at different depths. So we were trying to give this rifle a really nice 3D look. So that's pretty much all that the layers are for. And so imagine you're making a sandwich, right? So you can layer everything up how you want it, and at the end, if you want, you could go back and cut the crust off, or you can slice it in half if you want. That's what you're doing with your layers window here in Lightburn. You're just putting all your layers together. You start with all the engraving ones first, and then you go back and you cut out your little pieces, and at the end you can cut the whole piece out. And that's controlled here in the cuts/layers window. And that's really what it looks like. And you really don't need to get into it to have fun with the laser or start working with it. There really is a simple way to get started. And you can organize the order of it as well. So just keep that in mind, that the order here will affect the order in which the machine processes the layers. So you want to do your engraving first, and then you're cutting. And if you're cutting small pieces out of an item, you want to do those before you cut the whole perimeter out and the whole piece is loose. So a single click of each layer will bring up the summary of the parameters below, and that's where you can set them. You can sit in here and pop in the interval. Here's the speed. Here are your power settings, which we'll get into min power here in a second. And so it's really easy. Now, if you're doing something really complex, like I showed you previously, where you get a lot of layers, you might end up with a large list here. So it's real important to kind of make sure you get the order right. If you double click on any of these layers, it will go into the cut settings editor. You'll find the same settings in there, and then some, but you really could get started without even diving in there. So we have a question here. Will it automatically pick the correct order as long as we don't mess around with the order? It won't. There is a setting that will allow you to do that. And I can get into that, or we can definitely talk about that later. But I was trying to keep it simple, and I want to keep you guys mindful of it, to start with. So it will create a good habit if you're just consciously looking at it. But the answer is yes, there is a way to prioritize in Lightburn so that it automatically will be like, all right, we're going to do the engravings first and then the cuts. But personally, I think it's something you should really, especially in the beginning, know about and purposely plan. So here are the basics. Here are the 6 main settings that you want to start with so you don't get overwhelmed. You've got mode, speed, your 2 power settings, interval, and pass count. And you've got your layer color. That's the color palette on the bottom. It lets you assign up to 30 unique layers. And that gets a little tricky. So if you look at that rifle that I showed you guys, it was really hard for me to really differentiate between all the layers. So a little trick is if you right click on that swatch in that cut layers window where you have your list that I was just showing you guys, if you right click on it, it'll blink and show all the areas that are assigned that color will blink on the screen so you can identify them. So it's a pretty neat little trick that I didn't learn when I was doing that job, and I wish I would have. And then your mode is basically what tells your laser whether to follow the outline of a shape, or if you want to sweep to fill the inside of it, or both. So you're going to see fill. That's again for what we call raster or engraving, where the machine's sweeping and filling the inside of a shape. And then you've got your line mode, which is just going to trace the outside of the shape. If you pick fill plus line, it'll do the fill first, and then it'll do the line afterwards. Um, so yeah, that's exactly what I had explained there. And then you've got your speed, which we talked about a million times already, but um, it determines how quickly the laser will either trace that outline or scan that filled shape. And just remember that the speed influences, how long the material will have to absorb the heat from the laser beam. So just a reminder, you slow down the speed, it gives it more time to burn. And if you speed it up, it gives it less time to burn. And then we've got max power. This is an interesting little thing here, and I'll go into it a bit here. The power the laser will fire at once the speed set for that particular layer is reached. So whatever you put in for max power, the laser is not going to shoot at that power until it reaches the speed you set in the speed setting. This isn't really important when you're doing a fill or a raster engrave because, as we talked about, there's that overscan. So the laser will actually back up and accelerate towards your drawing with enough space so that by the time it reaches the edge of your drawing and it has to turn the laser on, it's already hit that speed and it'll hit your max power. But when you're cutting is where it's a little important to understand that. So when you're scoring or cutting, the speed will naturally vary, and the power will vary along with it. And that's something that you can control, which brings me to min power. So the min power is there to reduce uneven cut depths by adjusting that laser power to make up for changes in speed. So what's a good example of this? All right, you're driving a car and you have to adjust your speed often because you have to slow down if you want to take a bend or a turn. You can't, drive at the same speed every time that like how you do on a straightaway. And the laser is no different. So basically what you're doing here, because speed and power are tied together, this gives you an opportunity to really dial down the power as the laser is slowing down so you can maintain the same depth as it's making those turns. Again, this isn't a super intelligent machine. It doesn't give you a whole lot of control. But I would recommend if you are going to play around with this, that you set your min power between 15 and 20% to compensate for that. Just note that if you are playing with your min power and you have it set, a lot of times, you forget you have it on. And so you just want to make sure that, if you're cutting through something, I always set the min and the max to the same power that you want. So if you're cutting and you're using 80, 90% power, set your min to 80, 90%. If you're cutting completely through something, it usually doesn't matter. But if you're doing something like cardstock, that's when you kind of want to play with stuff like this because, that's when, the parts that you're cutting out will start to look weird on certain corners where the laser, just basically gets hotter because it has to stop and make a 90-degree turn. And each time it's slowing down, it's getting hotter in those corners. So that's something you can definitely play around with, but you don't need to. I mean, you just to start, make your min and your max the same number and you're fine. We talked about interval and, that's again, the how tight the passes are together. But one thing I want to point out here is it'll also affect how long the job takes to complete. So here's my lawnmower analogy. All right, you're pushing a lawnmower, and as you reach the end of the yard, you turn around and you come back the opposite way, and you purposely trying to overlap it. Right, you don't want to leave any blades of grass uncut, but you don't want to do extra work. If you're overlapping too much, you're going to be there all day. So that's where the interval is kind of, you try to find that sweet spot because the tighter you make it, the longer the job takes, the more work you're really asking the laser to do. And then your pass count, I really have never, really used it. It does set the number of times you can repeat the design. So, it'll just do it multiple. If you put 2, it's going to trace that cut line twice. The only real good applications for it is if you're trying to do a really deep engraving or cut a really thick piece of material that the laser can't do in one pass. But it really is best to refocus in between each pass, which LIGHTBURN lets you do. So there is some functions in LIGHTBURN that will adjust the height of the material so your focal distance gets adjusted between each pass. And that's really neat. But using pass count, if you're not using that, is to me, it really doesn't have an advantage. If you really need to do a really thick piece of material that takes multiple passes, I recommend you run it once, and then you adjust the focus, deeper into the core. Again, that's lifting the bed up closer to the laser head, maybe by 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters, and then you run it again. And that just gets, the laser deeper and deeper and deeper in there. Same with engraving. If you want to do a really, really deep engraving and you want it to come out nice, you want to always be engraving with the tiniest point on that focal point. So that's where you could do multiple passes, and little by little, you can get deeper and deeper without the focal point getting too big, your spot size. So just little things here I'm pointing out because we're talking about them, but not really a whole lot of practical applications for them. So we have a question: how thick can a Mira 9 cut through? Well, using this, I mean, how much time do you got, right? It really is. I mean, I've seen a lot of people doing 1/2 inch. That laser tube that's in the Mira 9s, that Resi W2, that was one of the first laser tubes I ever got in my very first Chinese laser. And I was able to cut a 3/4 inch piece of oak with it at a crawl. I mean, I was at like 1 millimeter per second, 100% power. But it did it. It did it. So, it's lasers are great for cutting. But when you start getting the really, really thick material, you're not going to get a really nice edge. It's not going to create a nice flat line, because again, the laser beam comes into focus. It makes a cone shape. And then when it goes out of focus, it makes that reverse cone shape. And that's what you're cutting with. So, the thicker the material gets, the less straight that it'll be. It'll be extremely charred, and you'll need to finish it. You need to sand it down or do something like that. But it really depends on the material. I mean, that's the big thing here. It depends on the material and and how you have the machine set up. So when I did that 3/4 inch piece of oak, I had my alignment on point. I mean, all my mirrors and lenses were perfectly clean. And I had an air compressor, and I was, blowing extra air on there. And even that, let's get into that. If you are going to use an air compressor, there is a sweet spot to how much pressure to use. So I always found that between like 20 or 30 PSI was helpful for cutting, because if you go too much, again, you're using air to blow out the flame, which is kind of counterproductive. You're trying to actually start a fire. So you've got, on one end, you're trying to create heat, and then the other end, you're blowing it out. So you want to use that compressed air to help you not start, a bigger fire than you want. But, I have people that are like, oh yeah, I use 50 PSI. I'm like, you're blowing on your food while you're trying to cook it. It's just not going to get hot very effectively. So even that has to get dialed in right to do that. But yeah, I'd say, you guys could definitely, get into some 1/2 inch if you check all those boxes. That's a great question. And then the last little thing, there's 2 toggles in the on that cut layers window. One is show and the other is output. And the best way I can explain it is show will allow you to choose which layers are visible on the screen to you, and output allows you to choose which layers are visible to the laser. So if you don't want to see it, let's say you got a lot of, like that perfect example, that color guard rifle, a lot of layers going on there. For me to edit a particular layer, I had to turn off, I'll toggle show off on a bunch of layers so that I can play with just the ones that I'm working on, not have all the other ones in the way. And if you're working maybe with a job that you're going to puzzle together different types of material, that's where the output one is nice. So you can, send that job and just output the layers you want to cut for each material that you're throwing in there, but you're running it off of one job. So yeah, it's pretty helpful. Whew. Gosh, you guys still with me? I know I got you guys muted there, but sometimes I wonder. I hope they're still listening. So, next we're going to talk about, how to run a job here. Oh, well, let's take some questions. All right, here we go. We got another one. Oh, someone said we are. Oh, thank you. Okay, so people are still here. Good. So I want to talk about running a job now in LIGHTBURN. And there's a number of ways to do it. And there's a number of workflows you can do. Um, and it all depends really on where you have your computer set up in relation to the laser and that sort of thing. But I do want to point out that I am going to show you one very easy workflow, and there are many. So this is the laser window in LIGHTBURN, and this is very, very appealing to people because they're like, oh, I can start, stop, pause, do all that stuff right from my computer. Don't. You can. Eventually, I would say you're going to find instances where like, hey, I'm just going to press start. I know what I'm doing. But actually, I even recommend there's a feature in the settings that will disable the start button and it'll hide it from you. Do it. It's when you press start, it's going to start the laser. And so if you're not in the same room or you're far away from the machine, you've got to sprint over to it and make sure things are all right. But really, this window is good for sending jobs to the machine, including the starting position and the order in which things will cut. So here are those optimization settings that I'm not going to get into because this is we're trying to give you guys the basics so you can start having some fun with it. I plan to follow this up with a second, more intermediate class, and then we'll get into optimization settings. But for the time being, just control the order of the cut layers like we were talking about earlier. Be in charge of that part. And if you want to dive in here, LIGHTBURN's great. You can hover over any button and press F1 on your keyboard, and it'll launch a help menu about that section. So there's a lot of good documentation you could dive into and start playing around with. I'm going to focus on the send button, and I'll talk about the frame buttons as well. But I'm really going to put a lot of time into the start from position and the job origin because I want you guys to understand how that works. So again, here's the start button. I don't recommend it, but it's just so you know, if you hit start, it sends the job immediately. So you better have your computer nearby because you're going to have to sprint over to the machine. And, there's never an instance where I would feel comfortable enough hitting start and being like, yeah, okay, the laser's doing its thing. I don't need to go over there and check it out. Like, I got this. Yeah, don't do that. So let's skip over that. And all these things, by the way, are controlled at the keypad. So I'm going to go through this really quickly because I really don't want you guys using it. But pause from the software momentarily pauses the job. If you hit it again, it resumes. So you want to pause a job so you can inspect it, or just make sure it's working right. Stop will stop the job, and it won't let you resume it. So it completely aborts that job for you. So if you want to inspect the job, and you don't want to, you want to have the option to resume, don't use the stop button. And here's a good one. If something is wrong and the laser is whatever, you got a fire starting or something like that, don't run to your computer and look for the stop button. Okay. There's one on the machine. And there's an e-stop on the machine. That's where you want to use for stop as your default. So again, these things are kind of cool because you can do it all from your computer, but it's dangerous. Send. This is how you're going to send jobs to the machine, especially right now. I want you all using the send button. So it takes the current design to the memory of the machine, which is then stored in the memory of it. And it's an accessible file that you can launch without the computer. I love this. You don't have to have the computer every time you're going to run the laser, especially if you have a recurring job. Send it and it's stored in the laser's memory. Really, really cool. This method is also ideal for, if you're going to be maybe doing a lot of jobs at once. So let's say, you've got your workload for the day and you want to do all your designing inside your house because it's hot in your garage or whatever. You can make all your artwork and send it via Wi-Fi. Just send all the jobs to the machine and they're all going to be waiting there for you. So when you're done doing all your design stuff, all your settings, then you go in the garage and you start loading material in the machine and pulling those jobs up straight from the laser. So I'm a big fan of this. There are some frame options in the software. I'll just go over them because there is one that's really appealing. Now the bounding box frame option, it's really going to use the red pointer that's coming out of your laser head to draw a perimeter around the image that you're trying to engrave or cut. So it will draw a square around it, and that's just so you can position it on the material where you want and have a visual representation of that. But again, if you're pressing frame from your computer, you're obviously sure that there's nothing in the work area that it's going to crash into. So it's, it is risky. I prefer you frame from the machine as well. So you're standing right in front of it and you're certain that there's nothing that it's going to, crash into. The speed of the frame function from the software is controlled in the move window in LIGHTBURN. So just a little note, there's an adjustment there you can make to how fast it frames. And then LIGHTBURN does have this neat little rubber band type of frame option. And it basically combines the perimeter of the outermost shapes in a job. So it's not making just a box around it, but it's kind of looking for the edges of all the shapes that are towards the outside of the drawing. Like a rubber band, it just kind of compresses around all of your artwork. And that's good if you're doing something like a diagonal shape or a triangle, right? So if you're trying to plot a triangle perfectly onto, with your red pointer, it really isn't going to help to see a square. It's nicer if you can actually have the laser trace an actual shape like a triangle. So that's pretty neat. And here's the stuff that's really important. You've got that start from drop-down menu. And this is where you choose the method for referencing that starting position in the machine. A lot of people struggle with this, and so I want to take some time here to really explain it. So there's three options. You have absolute coordinates, current position, and user origin. And I'm going to go over each one of them. So absolute coordinates starts the job in the exact X and Y location of the work area relative to the coordinates of the artwork on your screen. So this is really how things used to work in the old days. I used to never have a red pointer or a camera. It was all done based on coordinates. And it took a little while to get used to, but it's really fast because then you're not visually trying to align something, you're just using numbers to do it. So how does this work? Well, if you use absolute coordinates and your artwork is on the middle, in the middle of your screen, it's going to land in the middle of your work area. It's that simple. It all correlates that way. And a really cool way to really set that up, I find it really helpful when you're using templates, so that you can throw, let's say, I know a lot of people were doing watch bands, right? So they were making these templates out of wood. And the key to using a template is you want to make sure it lands in the same spot every time. So you can just throw it in the machine, fill it up with watch bands and hit go. And so if you add an L-shaped ruler to your machine, it's a nice handy way to really make that happen easily. That would be basically on the back right-hand corner, because that's where your machine starts counting from 0 in both the X and the Y direction. So if you gotta, you can use your laser to do it. Cut a piece of acrylic into an L shape and just make sure that you're setting it perfectly, where 0 is at. And that, it's square with the way the laser head travels. And then you can just throw material in there and it lands in the same spot. So it's super repeatable. And it streamlines the setup. It's not visual. It's just, you're relying on longitude and latitude again. Current position is a user-defined starting point. So it's not using coordinates. You're basically jogging your laser head using the red pointer to a desired spot on your material. And that's where the job is going to start. That's the start position of the job. You're not going to use this right now. This is really, again, for when you're sending jobs from the machine. That's when I find this to be helpful, because you can also jog the laser from the machine. So you can, if you're looking at your screen, you can tell the laser, jog to this X and Y coordinate, and then you set it to current position and it starts from that spot. And you could do it all without having to get up and, go look at your machine. So, it's cool, but again, it implies that you've got it all under control and you're not really new at this. So I don't recommend that. But it does have one advantage, and LIGHTBURN does let you store multiple start positions. So, I tried to think really hard, like what a good example would be where you'd need one. And I really was having a hard time figuring that out. I was like, I don't really know that, there's going to be a moment where I'm going to want several start positions and just trigger them from my software. So it's cool. And I bet, the guys at LIGHTBURN had a lot of fun designing it, but I haven't found a real practical use for it. User origin, that's what you guys are going to be doing. And that's the same thing almost as the current position, but it's programmed into the machine. So you actually go over to the machine, you jog the laser head to your desired starting position, and then you press the origin button on the keypad and it stores it there. So you can move the laser head after that wherever you want. That origin is still going to be stored there until you override it with pressing the origin button again in a new location. And this is really helpful for like one-off items. If you're just going to engrave something that you need one-off, you throw in the machine, you jog to your origin point, you hit origin, you frame it, and you hit start. And that's really how easy it can be. And it's also helpful just to run any job that's stored in the machine's memory to be able to do that. So user origin, big fan of it, and it's really a safe way to get started. And all of this, with the exception of the absolute coordinates. So if you're using current position or user origin, you get to pick what part of the job it relates to. And that's called the job origin. And so basically you can decide whether that start position correlates to the center of your drawing or to any of the corners on the drawing, or even the spots in between corners, midway between the corners. So just a note, the job origin gets grayed out if you choose absolute coordinates, because it's just going to go based off of the X0 and Y0. But on your screen, the job origin is represented by a small little green square, and I'll show you that here in a minute. And that's how you'll know. So wherever you put that laser head on your material and your red pointer is shooting, wherever you press that origin button, store that position, it's going to correlate to wherever that little green square is in your software. And that's all you need to remember. So, I made a little pre-launch checklist here. This is basically, a quick little checklist that you should go through before you initiate a job or actually send it to the machine. So, we're assuming you have all your artwork done, and basically, you're going to have your cut layers. You're going to go through all the summaries of power settings and speed and interval. I click through every layer before I hit send, because I want to make sure that, you double check and make sure. And that's where that little cut layers preview comes in handy. You want to choose your order of layers and what's going to be output and what isn't. And then you want to preview it. LIGHTBURN has a really great preview feature. Use it. It's great. It's going to not only make sure that you're doing things in the right order, but it'll show you how long it's going to take. And there's some optimization that you can do to make jobs, to strategically order jobs so that they take less time to do. Your start from and your job origin, we just talked about that. So you want to always double check those. So, keep your start from set to user origin, and your job origin's up to you. I generally use the center node or the top right. So I'm always referencing either the center of a piece of art or the top right corner of a piece of art. In LIGHTBURN, you also kind of want to check your devices and make sure that it's in the ready state. Sometimes you lose connection and you're trying to send the job and you can't. So there is a devices button in that same window in the what do you call it, the laser window that we were just looking at. And if you right click on that devices button, it resets the connection. So if you're having trouble with your connection or it says disconnected in that window, just right click over the devices button and it should reset it and it should read ready. So that's what you're looking for before you hit send, is you're just kind of looking to make sure it still says ready on there, and then you can send it to the machine.